Started. We have a webcasting audience that is expecting us to start at 2 p.m., so we'll get going. I'm Mike Nelson. I work for Cloudflare, doing public policy around the world, trying to make sure the internet grows faster and better, and also make it safer. I also teach at Georgetown. For the last 7 years, I've been teaching classes on what's shaping the internet and how to predict the futures. Another class I teach is called Creating a Culture of Innovation, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We have an amazing panel exploring the question, what are the politics of innovation, and is it possible that the internet causes too much disruption? How many people know what Betteridge's Law is? Betteridge is a member of the British Parliament, and a few years back he invented a law which is, if a headline asks a question, the answer is inevitably no. So when the National Enquirer says, were those UFOs over the White House? The answer is no, but you probably read the article. We are going to explore this question though. Is the internet causing so much innovation and disruption that it is leading to a tech backlash, leading voters to think, well, maybe this internet isn't such a good thing. When I first got involved in internet policy 25 years ago, every politician was jumping all over themselves to say, oh, I like technology, the internet must be good. In the 80s, we had something called the Atari Democrats, people who were all excited about video games and the new technologies like the internet. A lot of people didn't know what the internet was, but they were in favor of it. Now you can find politicians who are saying, you know, I'm not sure. Uber seems to be causing problems in the streets of Paris. Airbnb is causing hotels to complain. We have all the complaints about privacy, about gaps between the skills that people have and the skills they need to compete for jobs in the internet age. And we're going to explore all of these issues and specifically look at the question, is the political dynamic changing? Are people getting fed up with all the change? And is there something that the internet community needs to do to help the laggards, the skeptics, come on board and get as excited about the internet as most of us are? We have a quite exceptional panel, and we do have one mystery panelist to my right. I had a hard time finding somebody who was willing to stand up in front of a group of internet fans and say, I don't like the internet. This gentleman has volunteered to do that as long as he could wear a bag over his head. His name is Customer X, and he will be channeling all of us, all those people that we know. Most of us have an uncle who just doesn't see why the internet would ever be useful, or some other relative or neighbor who is completely perplexed why anybody would ever want to use Facebook. Customer X is going to channel that skepticism. Customer X is also a world-renowned expert on the people who don't adopt the internet. He's done work for the Federal Communications Commission. He's also done work for the Pew Research Center, collecting statistics on the attitudes toward the internet. Our first speaker is going to be Lee Rainey. He's the founder and head of the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which is the definitive source of information for how Americans are using the internet. I've been very pleased to be on the Pew Internet and American Life advisory panel since its inception, and I've been very impressed with all the statistics they've gathered. Our third speaker will be Alan McQuinn. He's a research assistant with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, and in addition to many other things, he knows Mandarin Chinese, which is he will not be using today. But maybe you can give us some perspectives from over there. And our last speaker is a former colleague from Georgetown when I was teaching there in the Communications, Culture, and Technology program. Meg Letta-Jones is an expert on new technologies. She's done a lot of work on robotics and has recently written extensively on the right to be forgotten and the need in Europe and elsewhere to erase the internet. So we have a mix of skeptics and supporters. We have a lot of knowledge on this panel. In addition to having a unique customer X here, we also have another special feature that none of the other panels have here. We have 2 door prizes. So this is an audience participation event. Whoever asks the best question or the most provocative question, as judged by the 5 panelists, will get a door prize. More exciting, you get to decide which of the 5 of us has the best answer. So at the end, we'll award these prizes, and you'll be impressed with what they are. Quite unique. So anyway, we're going to go.
It's not a bag.
It's not a bag. Although customer X will give you the bag if you can guess his name. So anyway, we're going to go down the line. Each speaker is going to give just 2 or 3 minutes on who they are, what their viewpoint is, and then we're going to dig a little deeper into these issues. So Lee?
Thanks, Mike. One of the really nice things about...
Oh, turn it on, please.
Yeah. Turn it on the top.
Yeah, pull it towards you.
Hey, don't ask me for help.
Thanks, Mike. One of the really wonderful things about being an employee of the Pew Research Center is that we don't have a dog in this fight. If we found that there were lots of people thinking there's too much disruption, there's too much of everything, the internet is overly stressing people out as compared to improving their lives, we'd be happy to report it. We've asked those questions a lot because this is a central question about the social impact of the internet that we've been studying. But every which way from Sunday that we've asked questions about the sort of broad impact of the internet on people's lives, on their communities around them, and on their wider society, the overall verdict has generally been, we like it, we want more, rather than we're stressed out and we want less of it. So I'll just run down, because I'm a data nerd and this is what I contribute to conversations like this, I'll just run down some major statistics as we've asked people sort of for the big judgments about the role of the internet in their lives and communities. 90% of internet users say the internet has been a good thing for them personally, 6% say it's a bad thing. 76% say it's a good thing for society, 8% say it's a bad thing for society. One of the big stressor issues that we get asked a lot about, so we've asked the question often from the very beginning of the project since the year 2000, is there information overload in people's lives? 72% of internet users report they like having so much information and they like the proliferation of data sources coming into their lives. Only 26%, and that number has not budged in 15 years as all this technology has come into their lives. 26%, a quarter say, yeah, I feel some information overload. So it's not trivial and it's not nobody, but it's certainly the overwhelming experience of the culture that they like more information, they like it from more sources, they like the variety of things that are going on. We found that when we ask people, what would you give up? You know, if you don't like it, if it's bringing too much into your life, would you give it up? The 2 things that top the list of technologies that people would never give up, the internet and cell phones. More so, they'd give up TV, their landlines, and email. So this is, again, sort of, as it's become more important to people's lives, they've embraced it, embedded it in their lives, it's brought into the rhythms of their lives rather than something they don't want. Is it a bad place? What's this broad social tone of the internet? 76% say it's a mostly kind place in their experience of it. 13% say it's a mostly unkind place. 70% of people say they've seen goodness actually happen to them. They've witnessed altruism that directly affects their lives. 25% say they've seen people bullying and ganging on other people. Again, not trivial, but not the majority experience. More than half of people have said they've watched people come together on the internet to help others solve a problem or to rally to someone's cause. That's double the number. 25% say they've watched people be bullied and be taken down by these things. Most people say that the internet helps them learn new things. 76% say it helps them learn new things. It ranges from products to news to popular culture to hobbies to friends to fitness to local news to their family to civic activities and things like that. And just finally, to add one to it, one of the constant questions we get asked since the rise of social media is it stressing people out? You know, a standard trope in this environment is you see your friends having better lives than you. And doesn't that make you feel worse about your life? And doesn't that make you sort of adjust or sort of prune your expectations about your miserable, sad life? The social media users as a whole feel no more stress than non-social media users. Women, under certain circumstances and certain social media platforms, actually feel less stress. And one of our hypotheses about why that's so is that women have harder lives to balance. They are often the kin keepers of their family. So on behalf of the whole household unit, they're maintaining relationships for the whole unit. They just got more things to balance in their lives, and these technologies help them balance those things better than if they didn't have them. Compared to the people who don't have them, they feel more stress in their lives. There's one exception to that, though. Social media is a fabulous awareness machine in people's lives. And so if you've seen distressing things happen in your friends' lives, then you do have a somewhat higher level of stress. But again, it's mostly because you're now newly aware and you can offer social support to people in ways that you couldn't before. So net, on almost every dimension of social, personal well-being, the internet is helping people feel better off and helping people feel less stressed. And their only stress is trying to stay up with the change because they're anxious to know what's around the corner and embrace it in their lives.
So that's the good news. Now we'll hear a rebuttal from customer X.
Thank you. You know, on the internet, nobody knows if you have a bag on your head.
But on a webcast, they do.
Yeah. Before I get going, I have this Palm Pilot here. Does anybody have a stylus? I lost my stylus, and I need to take some notes. And I found a stylus. I keep one in every suit jacket. It's a really smart thing to do. It helps me cope with things. So I got the stylus. They're pretty cheap on eBay, I can tell you that, because I lose them constantly. It's really something else. But in terms of this disgruntled customer X, let me bring a few facts to the table on this issue. First of all, in terms of technology use and adoption, not everybody has this stuff. There's something like a third of Americans who don't have broadband at home. Probably about the same number don't have smartphones, which everybody seems to be completely reliant on these days, except me. And so not everybody has this stuff. But the other thing that I think is important to recognize is a lot of people who have all the gadgets of modern connectivity don't really have the skills to use them. I've seen some research that suggests that as many as a third of adult Americans are deficient in digital skills, meaning they don't quite know how to use these gadgets, or they don't have sufficient levels in trust in the online environment to really take advantage of these new gadgets. So we get a degree of disgruntled customer X's out there, people like me, who may have all the stuff because they feel some peer pressure to get these gadgets. Maybe they're slow to upgrade, but they eventually get this stuff. And yet they really don't have the skills to use it. And they may not have really, given the digital culture we're in, the confidence, or they might not feel comfortable in telling people they need help. And so I think we have to be attuned to that. A lot of these people, for instance, I think go to the library, thank goodness for libraries, to turn for help on how to use these kinds of gadgets. So I think in terms of our theme today, the politics of innovation, I think given that we have a substantial number of Americans who have all the gear but not all the skills to use these gadgets fully, given rising expectations in society that everybody's connected and everybody ought to go online to solve whatever problems they may have, whether it's with a government agency or customer service kinds of issues, we really have to be sensitive to the fact that there are large swaths in the U.S. and I'm sure in other nations who are in that sort of grumpy consumer X category. I think we, in terms of the main theme of the politics of innovation, that should be seen, I think, as a place to look at for industry developing new projects and products to see how these people are or are not using these gadgets fully, whether they have some interesting workarounds that product designers didn't think of, and how to fold that kind of feedback back into the innovation process. So I'm here to tell you that I have many, many fellow travelers out there who are not completely content with digital culture, but I also think that that could be an opportunity for developers in the public sector and the private sector to be attuned to those kinds of needs and preferences so that future technologies can be more readily adopted for all consumers and all segments of society.
Thank you very much, Mr. X. Okay, now I'm going to turn to Alan. Unlike this, old curmudgeon here, Alan is a young person who's supposed to be a digital native, I understand. So, Alan.
Hi, I'm Alan McQuinn. I'm with ITIF, which is a nonpartisan public policy think tank dedicated to technology and productivity. So I guess I'm the optimist here. So as you look at new technologies that come out, there's always an inevitable kind of small pockets of resistance to each and every type of technology, to the internet, to everything. But by and large, there's a positive effect. And policymakers, as they try and address regulating the internet, they should be technology champions because we're getting a huge boon and a huge positive net effect for society. One of the major concerns has always been kind of this idea of jobs, correct? We're losing jobs, but if you look at McKinsey has estimated that for each job the internet displaces, it puts back 2.6 new jobs globally. And that makes sense. For each industry that ends, several more take its place. 10 years ago, we didn't have any cybersecurity, or we didn't have any cryptocurrency transmitters. We didn't have any drone operators. Think about it. 10 years ago, or in 2012, the app industry had 500,000 people that it employed. 5 years before that, in 2007, 0. Today, almost twice as many. These are jobs that are important, and they spring up. Now, I think that policymakers, as they kind of will start to look past the sudden rigmarole, as it were, that comes up with each and every new technology. Now, as we kind of look at this panel, I kind of reject the notion that consumers are dissatisfied with the internet. In fact, they're much more satisfied than they ever have been. We've been adding more and more people to the internet every year, and services have spread dramatically, as evidenced by Uber. Now, sure, with each new technology, there's always this kind of backlash from incumbent interests and small subsets of society, but by and large, people love it, and that's why it spread so quickly. I look forward to this discussion, but thank you.
Okay, Meg.
Me too. This is going to be fun. So I do not perceive non-early adopters as pathetic creatures wandering around in the dark, not knowing what's up from down. I think that it is awesome that we have people out there that are reflective about the technology that they bring into their lives and how it changes their relationships, how it changes them. Reflection is good. Outright rejection, that's never good one way or the other. And to that point, I would say that it's important. Well, I don't know if it's important. My attitude is that innovation is not a synonym for good. It just means new. And policymakers should not be pro technology. They should be pro good policy. And I am supposed to talk about the right to be forgotten, so I will do that. But before I do, for some reason, history keeps coming up in this panel, which is kind of strange. And I wanted to mention there was a really great article in The Atlantic in the spring about computer anxiety that was covered in the 80s that was really, really great. And I can't remember what it's called, but I'm sure somebody can look it up on their phone and share it on Twitter or something. But we have seen this consistently. In the 50s and the 60s, post-war Europe was busy turning their judicial decisions into codified laws that protected privacy. 70s, we had a really big backlash, if we're going to call it that, against government databases. In the 90s, we had significant legislation in the European Union. And two of those articles led to a very controversial decision last May 2014, where a court of justice judge decided that two of the articles in the 95 directive, which is being replaced by the data protection regulation in the next few years, that gave users the right to object to the processing of their data and the right to rectify and correct their personal data, gave them a right to request the removal of links from their Google search results. So if you search my name, something bad comes up, if I was European, would have a right to fill out this form requesting that Google remove it. So since May 2014, 1 million links have been requested for removal. Around a half of those are accepted, and that changes from country to country depending on the percentages and who the type of people are that are requesting removal. But the biggest controversy surrounding it right now is, well, I guess there are two pieces of it. The compliance costs that Google has had to put forth after this ruling and them sort of being in charge of developing this right to be forgotten and how they're applying it. So the Article 29 Working Party that directs that does research for the European Commission on these kind of issues, told Google that they had to remove them from all Google domains. So Google was just removing them from the national domains. And Google has continued to just remove them from the national domains, even though the Article 29 Working Party has told them that they really are not supposed to be doing that. And the final thing is whether users should be notified that their search results have been altered, and whether the source of the information, whether it's a newspaper or website, should be informed that their page is not coming up on a Google search result for certain individuals. And so it's a great case study on how different people feel about the general benefits of the internet.
I think it's also a great case study because what we see there is people taking the old analogies, the old technologies they're familiar with, like newspapers. And in the case, I'm sure the judge just thought, well, we have a file, we could take the file and remove it. And with the internet, it's different. I mean, I see this where a lot of 50, 55, 60-year-olds will say, well, it's sort of like that, it's like the telephone. But I talked to a 15-year-old, and Skype isn't like the telephone. Skype is Skype. And so it leads to this dissonance, I think, where people are confused because it's doing what the newspaper does, but it doesn't behave quite like the newspaper because I can get it everywhere and people can find out about me even though the newspaper article is 12 years old. And so it's a conflict of analogy, right? We're familiar with one technology, and this new one is a better version of the old technology, but it does some things in addition that we don't like.
Yeah, we all use analogies to make sense of anything new. But I will say that the right to be forgotten is a very proactive way of addressing innovation. And if you look at US laws, we still have things like the single publication rule where you can only sue once because a newspaper came out, and if it defamed you, you get your money. And that was the end of it because what it mattered was in a basement somewhere. And so in a lot of ways, the US system seems pretty curmudgeon-y compared to some of these new approaches that also have some antiquated ideas in them, but they are trying to be innovative.
Yeah, okay. So let's go a little deeper here. Okay, we've talked about the laggards and how most people are very excited about the technology, but there are these pockets. There are tens of millions of Americans who aren't online, and when you ask them, they say, I don't really want to be. Who are these people? Is there a demographic difference? I mean, what's the subset as far as age, location, income?
Well, for the people who aren't using the internet or using a high-speed internet connection at home, they tend to be older with lower educational levels and low incomes. Those are sort of the three main drivers of non-adoption. So they just haven't made the step that a lot of us who might be in the upper socioeconomic ranges have made over the past couple of years to get online. And so these are the people who really do need help with digital skills if there is a desire to get them online. And of course, we do have increasingly the societal expectation that everybody's online, so therefore we can optimize systems, whether they're government systems or commercial systems, to go to that kind of demographic. But there's a sticky 20, 25%, maybe a little bit more people who aren't online, and they're older and they're lower income, and they are nonetheless a sizable part of the U.S. population.
And older people do vote. I mean,
So the numbers say, yes.
Yeah.
in addition to the demographics, they tell us a bunch of things about their lives. So they're poor, and resource issues are pretty significant stressors for them in a variety of ways. But even more so, they struggle with two other issues. One is relevance. They're not entirely sure that the value proposition is worth it in their lives. It's partly what Customer X was talking about, that mastering a new set of technologies just to get to the same old information doesn't necessarily convince them that it's worth it. They've also are more aware than you might expect of the problems that are associated with the internet. So they think a lot about stalkers and predators and cybersecurity risks and things like that, and can cite that a lot. Whereas if you are talking to them about high quality news information, high quality government information, better health information and things like that, they're not necessarily aware that the internet is a place where they can get that. And then there are the literacy issues that Customer X also talked about, is this stuff is not terribly consumer friendly in many cases, and they're worried that they hit the wrong button or they say the wrong thing or do something that's gonna, destroy a several $100 piece of equipment, and they don't necessarily know how to use it in a smart way.
Or worse yet, embarrass themselves terribly.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, if you talk to the people at the U.S. Commerce Department who worked on the BTOP program, Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, which really tried to get a bunch of people online who weren't online, the one word that they will use to describe non-adopters, fear. And Lee just touched on that, but there is just this fear of the bad things that can happen online and fear of messing with the technology and not being able to fix it.
Well, they say politics all comes down to fear and greed. So I suspect we've seen a lot of greed in certain parts of the industry, and fear certainly is a problem. So for the two of you, we just heard Lee talk about complexity, that being a barrier. Certainly, our industry doesn't always focus enough on ease of use. Cloudflare, we actually have 3 co-founders. One of them has a very simple title, which is Head of User Experience. So we've tried to make it part of our core. But there are certain companies, I will not name, that make a great deal of money by making systems more complex and then promising you a better experience every year with a new upgrade. How would you change the design of systems to help the laggards, help people feel more comfortable with this technology? And why isn't it done? Is there a policy problem? Why are people building these systems that are more complicated than they need to be?
Well, I'm going to be a brat again and say the complexity is inherent. The laggards, I don't know if we all feel so confident online that we know where our data is going, that nothing bad's happening. We can just afford to replace our computers once somebody plants a virus on it and the whole thing turns blue.
What company would that be?
I don't know. Don't they all turn blue? I haven't broken one in a while, I guess. Maybe they do something different now. But the complexity is challenging, and I think that that's okay. I mean, I think that part of the deception can be making something seem simple and clean and like you're in control and you understand what's going on when you don't. And so I think that this is not necessarily a question for the laggards in general. We talk a lot about this in privacy. How do we help people understand where their data is going, how it can be used? And we really haven't come up with a great answer. To be honest, there's a lot of battles about defaults and maybe you just shouldn't be able to do things with certain data because we have never really solved this usability problem based on the complexity of the system.
So it's about fear, greed, and trust. I would actually, I'd love to hear your answer. How would you fix this situation?
Well, I think that it's not necessarily a problem, and there is a generational gap as discussed by them. But my parents, my father just learned how to text message me 2-3 weeks ago. He's in his 60s and he's great. But as it goes, there's this great Douglas Adams quote that I think is very appropriate for right now. It says, anything that was made before you were born is natural and normal and just a part of things. Anything invented between the ages of 15 and 30 is new and revolutionary and amazing, and you can make a life out of it. And anything after 35 is against the natural order of things.
That's tweetable.
Fundamentally, things will be complex because it's relative to who you are and what you are. I have a niece who just got her first iPad, and she knows it better than I do, and I have had an iPad for 6 years. It's just as you get used to it. I agree with what she said in that as we look at privacy issues and issues of cybersecurity, we have to be very clear and concise with how we explain the product to people so that they understand the ramifications of things. But in the sense that it just is being made more difficult by being technology, I don't necessarily agree.
Well, we were talking about fear and greed, and there is a greed aspect here. Clearly, if you can put enough new features on your product, maybe one of them will be really exciting and people will buy your product and pay you more money for that. But there's also, I think, a public policy issue here. There's a patent issue here. People have to put something new out there so that they can be different than the other guy and so that they can get a patent on something that their competitor won't be able to replicate. So there's an incentive to come up with new stuff, and there's also an incentive or a barrier for companies that want things to work together. So we have situations where I'd like my product to work with your product, but you've got a patent and you won't let me build my product to work with your product because you control that patent and the interface doesn't work if I can't use your patent. And I don't want to pay a lot of money to work with you, so I've got this product that doesn't work well with your product, and people get frustrated and throw up their hands and throw out both products. I mean, this is a problem.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
it's
I
you
agree.
know, I've got several boxes of equipment that just had to go buy a new one because, again, the old one wasn't able to keep up with the technology that I wanted it to work with. Other ideas on how to fix the complexity problem?
I know I'm just going to maybe stick with Meg here and say I'm not sure that our data show that there is a complexity problem. Yes, having things work together and things like that is part of the story. But when Tumblr came out, we got a lot of queries, especially from reporters, because they assumed we'd start to measure it. And the question was, is it just one too many? Are there too many social media platforms already now for people to master? And just isn't this going to blow their minds? And the fact of the matter is we see people diversifying their social media habits, in part because there are different audiences on different platforms, in part because they're strategic about what information to share on those platforms. And there's definitely neurons firing in replacement of other neurons that are not firing, so as people manage all the complexity of this. But they're kind of all in for it, especially younger folks who were freaked out when their parents wanted to friend them on Facebook and wanted alternative sources of information.
That's why they moved to Tumblr.
They didn't. Yeah, well, they added Tumblr and they added Snapchat and things like that, and so people more are. Our data show they're in an additive frame of mind and managing the complexity rather than throwing up their hands and saying too much.
Okay, so one last question, then I'll turn to the audience participation part. Let's internationalize this discussion. Do we have any lessons we can learn from other countries? I mentioned that I was in Paris watching tires burning on the highways because the taxi cab drivers were protesting against Uber. It's very dangerous to try to use Airbnb in Paris because you might have a knock on the door at 2 o'clock in the morning and the police will throw you on the street because Airbnb is technically illegal in Paris. There's a lot of places where you're seeing government action to hold back innovation. Do we have any lessons we can learn from other countries, any place where they're either embracing the future or finding very creative ways to slow it down? And Alan, I'll start with you.
Now there's two big issues here. I think there are places like the United States where we're able to embrace certain different types of technologies over as they evolve. Like if you look at the evolution of Uber, initially there was a lot of people who were who pushed back against Uber, and there still are, especially incumbent interests like taxi cab companies. But at the same time, while you see this kind of insurgence of people pushing back from incumbent interests, you also see a rise of people calling their congressmen and saying support Uber, and now Uber is almost a tenet of one of the major parties where they're very supportive of this kind of model of breaking down different types of barriers. Now, as we look abroad and we kind of bring it back home, let me think about this. the way that you would the best way to kind of regulate these circumstances is to create a level playing field for both taxi cab companies and Uber in that circumstance, or hotels and Airbnb by deregulating on one side. Now, that's not to say that always regulations are bad, and sometimes internet regulations can be good. To follow up on the right to be forgotten case, in certain circumstances, if you're very smart and you're not overhanded about it, you should be able to delist certain types of material off the internet. One case in point is revenge porn. We wrote a report about this 2 days ago. This is a very terrible form of online harassment that is not punishable right now in the United States. And if you look abroad at Europe, the right to be forgotten is kind of more heavy-handed than that, and I'd like to hear a response. But it takes off all forms of content, even if it's legally created and legally distributed. So if it's inappropriate, outdated, or irrelevant, you can take it down in theory, and that lumps in a lot of speech. So it's issues of privacy, it's issues of free speech, and a balance of that with innovation. And we're still adjusting to all of these different things. So to point to one specific country is relatively hard in the circumstance, but kind of striving for balance is what ITIF would say.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. And I'll do a little promotion for ITIF. They've done a number of very impressive reports and conferences on technopopulism and some of the issues, not just related to digital technologies, but also the biotech, fear of frankenfood, some of the discussion about drones and privacy. The reports are quite interesting, and he's got a handout here you can pick up on the way out. So a little commercial for you, Alan.
Thank you.
So Meg, any examples from overseas in addition to the ones you've shared already?
For the most part, I discourage the U.S. and other countries from trying to transport in or out regulation. I think that Americans have a very specific culture. We have a very specific legal culture, and so trying to fit things into our system should be its own practice. But I do think that the Europeans, in particular, have been really agile on some things, and that's something that maybe we don't strive for in the same way. We don't try to match their structure, but try to find agility within our own system to try to move a little bit faster on some of these issues when they are deemed problematic. Because a lot of times we think of regulation as anti-innovation, anti-corporations, anti-making lots of money and creating jobs, but certainty is a huge deal. Right, and so if we can quickly give these companies certainty, that can go a long way also. A lot of times I think it's this big delay in, okay, which way are they going to come down on these things? Drones, I think, are a great example of that.
Okay, over to this side.
Well, when Consumer X worked in the government and we talked about why people aren't embracing technologies in a full-throated way and what or whether anything should be done about it, I can recall discussions of people saying, well, you know, the market will just innovate and make these technologies better and more useful for people, and the problem will take care of itself in that fashion. And what we found is that really isn't happening. The dial has moved slowly in the past couple of years in this country on certain tech adoption issues. The lessons learned on how to promote tech adoption tend to go into the category of it takes time, it takes boots on the ground, it takes patience. And so when you see in other countries some of these backlashes, whether it's Paris and Uber or other places, I guess my suggestion is to look at those, study those. There's in social science the great tradition of studying the outlier as a way to really understand an issue that's central to you. And I think since we're talking about the politics of innovation, to cast the net a little more broadly in looking for lessons which then can be taken back into the innovation system makes a lot of sense, both domestically and looking at some of these issues that may pop up internationally.
Lee, any?
Two thoughts. One, just to underscore Alan's nice point from Doug Adams. When we do surveys about technology adoption abroad, they're obviously at different places on the adoption curve. They're more recent to it. And so In lots of developing countries now, when we're asking if you're an internet user, almost by definition, you're a social media user. And remember, we're still going through this agonizing debate in America about trivial information, narcissists giving up privacy, goofballs taking over the conversation and stuff like that. It's not even relevant in lots of developing countries in the Arab world, in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, developing parts of Asia. You're in. Because social media is a way for you to pitch your voice into the common, to tell your story, to disrupt the media culture of your product. So in a way, they're sort of teaching us to calm down in some respects, or that these things can serve your purposes. The other thing that is relevant to this conversation is every 2 years we do surveys of experts. So they're not scientific surveys at all, but we invite a lot of experts to talk about the future of the internet. And a recurring theme in the most recent one we published a lot of stuff last year on it, was that technology is going to gallop ahead. The Internet of Things, increasing bandwidth, all sorts of ways, we are sort of going to lose control of the trajectory of technology. And the big worry was that human institutions won't adapt quick enough. It's a standard human history story that institutions are much slower to embrace the change, or to adapt the change, or to steer technology change in the right direction. And this is going to be a problem that's worse. So, I mean, just to underscore my buddy's recommendations here, watching a lot is going to be a requirement for lots of cultures, not just the United States.
I have a standard talk I give on the evolution of technology, and one of the best slides shows the march of technology. So the hardware races ahead, the software is right behind. The people kind of slowly figure out what to do with it. Then the organizations they're part of have to catch up. And then often 10 or 15 or even 20 years later, the policy finally gets up there. And that's not unexpected, because policy consensus requires getting millions of people to all agree to do something, whereas developing a neat new gizmo or an app might just require 3 or 4 people. But somehow we do have to close that gap. And maybe the policymakers have to use the technology to get better data, get more good ideas, move forward faster.
And as they look at that kind of policy, they need to be more flexible with how they adjust to things. So here in the United States, we don't really have a drone industry at all. And at the end of to follow up on her point, at the end of the year, we're going to finally have the first set of rules that's going to be good from the FAA. And at that point, we're expected to see between $3.6 billion and like $15 billion, don't quote me on that last one, of industry economy coming out of just drones flying in the skies. And right now, we're doing a halfway decent job of allowing people to use apply for exemptions to use the technology. We have about 500 companies. But if you look elsewhere in the world, in the top 10 drone manufacturers, the US doesn't have a single one. All of them are abroad, and most of them are in China. So we need to create kind of a more flexible, risk-based system there, maybe based off what other countries are doing.
I think that's going to be really true for the Internet of Things, for some of the new technologies that we're embedding in our infrastructure. Okay, time to start asking questions. I see several former students here. I hope they'll come up with as many good questions here as they did in class way back when. So introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, my name is. Sure.
Pull it up, pull it up, yeah.
Hi, I'm Lee Marie Thompson. I'm with the ISOC DC Washington chapter. And Customer X, you've been really, really polite. So I figured I'd shake it up a little bit. So, the argument can be made that there's a particular class of economic class of individuals that are not only participating in the internet, but also participating in the development of products, services, applications. And often these applications and services are catered to this particular class that's also participating in it. So how does this play in the adoption of the internet from those that are either mobile or otherwise underrepresented in this class structure? So hopefully, Customer X, you can rev it up.
Sure, I think you're pointing to a real disconnect that we see in the innovation system. So if you look at the typical internet user circa 1996, 97, he was a 37-year-old white guy who had a desktop computer and a dial-up connection and was probably, streaming the Eagles to his desktop to listen to music, or he had the CD in the tray there, listen to the Eagles. And the killer app back then, or one of them, does anybody ever remember Pointcast? Yeah, Pointcast. That was something that pushed headlines to your desktop over your dial-up modem, focusing mostly on news and finance and sports, catering to the typical user, the 30s, the Mike Nelsons back then. So today, if you look at the mobile space, the premise of your question is entirely correct. The adopters of smartphones tend to be over-indexed for African Americans and Latinos. Yet, when you look at some of the data that's been getting a lot of notice these days about whether companies who make this stuff are employing minorities and communities of color, there's not a lot going on there. And so that's the disconnect in the innovation system that you're entirely correct in pointing out. And I do think that there's certainly work to be done in thinking about how you go about closing those gaps. But I think what's not often thought about is that there can be a tremendous opportunity in terms of having really listening to a more diverse customer base to innovate in a somewhat different way and a more, possibly much more socially and economically more valuable way.
There's a,
Okay.
I hope I've got my facts right here. Even stuff that isn't necessarily designed from, a class sensibility, there's a growing amount of concern that in the era of big data, that all of the sort of differentiating you can do among people is not necessarily going to redound to people who don't have a lot of power and a lot of voice. The Boston had this wonderful experience, or this illustrative experience, with an app called Street Bump, where literally you could download the app from the city and you could say where a pothole was. And it's just, amazing thing, citizen-generated solution to a problem that everybody in Boston hates and stuff like that. Well, once they began to analyze the data from that, a lot of the potholes, an overwhelming number, came from better-off neighborhoods. So everybody could download the app, and it's the misconsumer.
You mean John Doe, right?
Yeah,
okay.
These things don't necessarily work out well, and it's a huge sensitivity to have, particularly as we enter an era where the data that were generated both advertently and inadvertently are going to be used to profile us.
Next question. And please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Evan with Tech Freedom. Given that the FCC has announced that it's going to use its Title II authority to get in the privacy game, they're asking companies to get advisory opinions before using new business models or products or changing their privacy policy. Would you see that as a threat to disruptive innovation, given that companies like Uber and the like have different privacy policies and different business models that are coming out?
I'm going to turn to Alan for a comment on that, and then I might have a few comments as well. Our colleagues here, I know Lee at least is, as he said, does surveys, doesn't do policy recommendations. But Alan?
Sure. Short answer, I think that Title II will have interesting ramifications that we don't quite know yet, especially if they start putting in the privacy components of Title II. Now, my colleague Doug Brake primarily covers these issues, so I'm not 100% on it. But what I can talk about, kind of this area, is from the tech populism piece that was cited earlier, where we've seen a growing kind of resistance among certain communities based off of kind of noisy advocates, right? Where we see that a lot of the facts of the debate have been kind of pushed to the side as people have been more focused on like individual benefits over community benefits. So a good way to look at this outside of the kind of telecom debate is with red light cameras. We see populists push back against red light cameras when, by and large, I hate red light cameras. I'm sure most people here hate red light cameras, but they do in fact decrease the amount of fatalities that are around. And we see that with certain kind of arguments to curtail them, they just hurt society, even though they're good. Is basically how I can say.
If I can add to that, our CEO at Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, wrote a very hard-hitting editorial about why the net neutrality regs are a bad idea. We're very much in favor of seeing competition in the marketplace and giving consumers lots of choice, which we believe will drive to a network where there's not discrimination. But the idea that the FCC is going to get involved in some of these areas, particularly some of the privacy areas, is a little troubling because the regulations are not well defined in these areas. And that's, I think, what worries us most. And I think that also worries a lot of politicians. It's one of the reactions you see when people are worried about the future. They will write some vague regulation that says, let's fix this problem. But then that leads to a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace and can really slow innovation down and can actually decrease the number of choices that consumers have and can decrease the chance that we get good solutions to the policy problems that the policymakers are trying to solve. Next question. And please
Jim
do
Sang, I'm a retired applied physicist, and I've actually commercialized things. So I would ask two related questions, which I actually would like to find out why the questions are bad. One is, my wife is a historian, and I've learned the phrase "wig history," which is that we tend to write history from the point of view of the winners and look back. And as a technologist, I know there are lots of dead ends that get pursued through history and even now. And so there's the question, we talk about creative destruction, but it's very hard to price the destruction. And so so it's a macro question as to, yes, there's a macro advantage to the innovation, but what is the cost of the destruction? And the second, which is closely related, is with secular stagnation and the like, there's a tendency to say, the government bureaus are just measuring GDP wrong, and that all the good news things that are showing up nowadays are simply not properly priced. And I tend to accept that point of view. But what happens if, for example, Gene Fama is right and the markets are efficient and the current prices are correct?
Wow, 3 really big, hairy questions. Does anybody want to take that?
Go ahead. I don't know how to answer the second one. You know how I get squeamish around economic questions. I love the first point. I just had coffee with Pamela Long, who's a wonderful DC historian yesterday, and she was talking about how in this Roman period there was this big debate, this big split about whether whether society should be trying to move back and be more like the ancients or trying to move forward. So it's this moderns versus the ancients debate. And it's funny because we never really think about going backwards anymore, right? It's not very American. We think about how do we move forward effectively? How do we see the future in a new way? And so I think there's so much comfort when you talk to historians, I think, because we've made it through a bunch of stuff. Good for us. We'll be fine with all this internet stuff. I did want to point out something. Red light cameras are a great idea. My research on red light cameras shows quite the opposite, that when you put them in at intersections, they actually cause more accidents than than before, because people know how to interact with each other. They don't account for the human in the loop of driving. If they were, Google robot cars, I'm sure nothing would ever go wrong. But yeah, so just introducing technologies and assuming that they're going to perform perfectly and that people will adapt to them, history has shown us that it is a really, really complicated mix. And the existing technology is really important to that. So we have to remember that that new thing is tied to something old, and that transition is a little bit complicated. And I don't know how the FCC will deal with that, but they have been they have been our expert agency for a long time. I don't know what will happen when they start taking over privacy, but the FTC has been they are quite limited by what they're allowed to do, and so it may turn out to be a great thing.
I'd love to read your research on red light cameras, first of all, but
Sure.
thanks. But just to kind of get back to that idea of disruption. In 1900, it took 100 people the same amount to make the same amount of corn agricultural output that it takes 3 to do today. those 98 people went back in, they lost their jobs at the time, but they went back into society and created social good in other areas. So if we're going to be pushing people out and creating and destroying and having this kind of fallout, we need to put in the right kind of workforce trampoline to push people back into society. And ITIF has long advocated for kind of retraining programs and for realigning higher ed to enforce STEM or to reinforce STEM. And I think that's kind of gets to your first point.
Well, I think you're getting to one of the critical points of this panel, which is that people are very, very uncertain about this future where all their training might only be good for 7 or 8 years. You know, the things are moving so fast that they're going to have to retrain 3 or 4 times. They're going to have not just 10 or 15 jobs, they're going to have 4 careers. And I think that's what I see in a lot of countries when you talk about the pace of technology. It's a truism that the students I've been teaching are going to end up having jobs that don't exist today. Sometime in the next 30 or 40 years or 50 years of their career, they're going to do jobs that we can't, maybe we can imagine, but we don't have a job title for what they're doing. And I do see that as one of the sources of these legislative counteroffensives to hold back the new apps that are creating the new jobs and displacing the old workers. I'm very involved in a group called Innovation for Jobs. Their next meeting is here in D.C. on September 1st, and we've met in Munich and Paris and Silicon Valley, and we keep coming back to this interesting dynamic where this group believes there's going to be new jobs, but somehow we've got to get through the adjustment phase. We've got to give people the safety net that allows them to learn the new jobs. We might have to completely restructure the way people live their life. One of the most powerful pieces of art I've seen in the last 30 years was at the Philadelphia Museum of Modern Art. And it was by an artist who commented on society through his art. And he had one piece that was just 3 bars. The first bar said, education. And around age 21, it stopped. And then it said, career, 21 through about 65. And it stopped. And then it kind of faded out, and it said retirement. And then he had the new lifestyle or the new lifespan. And in that case, education started, but you took a break around age 16 or 18. And then you maybe took a year vacation, and then you took did a little bit of work, and then you went back and did some more education, and then you did 5 years of a job, and then you took another year of vacation, and then you did some retraining. The result was you were working still at age 75 or 80. You had 6 or 7 years of vacation during your regular lifespan, and you'd also had all these extra years of education interspersed, because that's what's going to be necessary for the people graduating today. But business hasn't adjusted. Government hasn't adjusted. This is sometimes called the gig economy, where you're going to work on a certain job for 2 years and then do something new or go around the world or live on an ashram and then go back and do something else. It's a much more flexible but unstable world, and it's one of the reasons I think people are scared of the technology. They're just too certain. They've seen too many cases where the technology is putting them out of business. Any comments on this side, on the new lifestyle, the gig economy, fear of displacement?
I would just bring one thing to the discussion, which is what you see in articles you'll find online, just the proposition that maybe all these new gadgets are really about the social dimension, as Lee says, and not so much about productivity enhancement. I mean, there was a bunch of articles recently on the fact that measured productivity having risen quite quickly in the 90s due to the microchip has flattened off since then. Tyler Cowen has put out an ebook a couple of years ago suggesting that really all these innovations due to the internet are great for social purposes, but are they really about productivity enhancement? So I think we have to keep that in mind when talking about questions like you raised.
One quick prediction. I bet you we will, within the next decade, have a really killer great new set of economic measuring systems and indices and things like that that will do a much better job of taking account of the things that we're all talking about. You know, we got behavioral economics in the last generation, which is just such an amazing advance in our understanding of human behavior, including economic behavior. We're going to see more of that.
Yeah. And once again, we'll say, so everything we used to know about economics was wrong. But I take your point. I think we're going to see a lot more interesting data. One of the questions posed in the description for this panel is the internet both increasing and decreasing productivity? And how can internet users sort out the useful applications from the useless ones? And we are seeing a lot of these articles about people spending way too many hours doing video games or social media at 2 a.m. I mean, there's a lot of statistics on that too, as insomnia goes up and social media use goes up.
Mutual buddy Clay Shirky wrote a wonderful book on it called Cognitive Surplus.
Yep.
We got a lot of more brain power to apply now.
Okay, next question.
Jeremy Pesner, GSA, and former student number 1, I guess. First off, I'll just say that video games and social media, even at hours like that, may not necessarily be useless. Let's put the brakes on that.
Some of my best friends are gamers.
I came in late, so if there's anything I'm missing in this question, please let me know. When you were talking about the complexity of the systems and how to make things work on behalf of customer X or customer any of us, I wonder if we can't just sort of go back to the technology itself and how it works at the most basic level. One example of what I'm talking about, if anyone's familiar with this little web app called If This Then That, or IFFF, the idea basically there is that it talks about the subatomic particles of functions that we do online every day, whether it's tweeting or sending an email, posting here, and you can link them together. So if you post here or tweet there, it will send this or do that. Or you can even bring it up to hardware to turn on lights and to do things like that. So this is talking about really empowering people at the basic level. Maybe the things they are doing aren't so profound, but can we really extend this philosophy to eliminating what the complexity or non-clarity or whatever we're calling with the system that we have today? Can we get something like that going that can empower people at the user level?
So making the building blocks easier to work with. Any thoughts?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, I think that there are a ton of great tools. Lori Craner's team at Carnegie Mellon and a bunch of other teams build great usability tools. I think part of the problem is scale. So you have this pretty cool app that tells you what happens in certain contexts, but if anybody has a phone, how many tabs up do you have at one time? Just to do that over and over again as you navigate changing privacy policies, I think can be really challenging. And I think that is the challenge that we've seen has been scale. It's not that they don't work. It's that we can't quite get people to integrate them in a way that really covers their basis in a way that they're trying to achieve.
And to your point, I think that If This Then That and certain other apps have actually increased productivity. And if we're trying to cut through, like bad apps to find good apps, consumer reviews generally help, and we've seen that actually helps the cream rise to the surface, right? So.
Other thoughts?
So, yeah, my name is Will Reinhardt. I'm with the American Action Forum, doing a lot of research on this, actually. And so I'm very interested in this subject. Specifically, I know that Pew has done a lot of research on the distrust in government. And so I want to talk about something a little bit different, which is the institutions themselves that deal with whatever change we have going on. It seems to me, or at least I could be convinced otherwise, but it seems to me one of the biggest articulations of problems here is that people feel like the other institutions that are meant to help deal with the displacement, whatever it may be, aren't working anymore. And the prime example that I have is in San Francisco, when you had Google come in, there was a reaction in 2012, 2013 to the actual prices of homes. Now, prices of homes in San Francisco, that's not really related to what Google has to deal with, or what the increasing incomes of individual people who work for Google or these other companies. It's far more and far clearly connected to local policies, housing policies, which are among the worst in the United States, if not the world. So I'm just wondering are we really kind of like losing sight of what the actual problem is here, which may be other things, but we're just saying, okay, technology has kind of asked us again to call this into question. And so now because technology has asked us to call into question these problematic issues, or these long-standing issues that we really haven't had to deal with before, that now we're kind of freaking out because we don't have the institutions to deal with them.
Like, I think you should answer that question since it's your question he thinks might be the wrong one.
I think Will and I are going to do a panel next year. But I do agree. I think this is part of the problem. If we had a safety net, if we had governments that weren't exacerbating the stresses that people feel when there's displacement or when they have to learn new skills, this would be a problem that wouldn't be so severe. And I think there are countries in Europe, Germany being the best example, where they have such an effective job retraining program that they've been able to move people from job to job with a lot less stress and strain and angst than you see in other countries in Europe, or in the US for that matter. So I take your point. I do think technology is part of the solution. If we can empower governments to be more responsive to the needs of individuals as they change jobs and as they need to learn new skills, that would be a very good thing. The rise of MOOCs is one thing that people point to, but I think social media can be used as an effective way for people to build a support structure as they maybe relocate to a new location to take a new job and need to find friends and people to help them navigate the new town or city that they're living in. So there's a lot to what you say, and I do think that this is an issue that a few people have started to talk about. Ellie Noam at Columbia spoke at the Global Internet Governance Forum in Istanbul, and he gave an impassioned plea for governments to step up to this, and for CEOs, particularly CEOs in the IT industry and in those companies that are causing the disruption, to address the fact that they are causing disruption and that maybe there's something they should be doing, either to push government to be more responsive to these needs, or spending some money from their pockets or from their corporate coffers to help make adjustment easier for people. So the fear of innovation and disruption would decrease as people saw that, yeah, change is coming, but I can deal with it. I'm a techno-optimist, cyber-libertarian Democrat. I believe that which is possible is inevitable. That doesn't mean it has to be really painful. I mean, inevitable can be a good thing. Anybody who is also a cyber-libertarian, techno-optimist Democrat can join our Facebook group. We have about 60 people from all around the world.
What is the name of the group?
Cyber-libertarian, techno-optimist Democrats. Or just, yeah, you can friend me and I'll point you there. Other comments on the need for better government?
I think there's always institutional barriers. Like with San Francisco, it's not only the municipal government, but it's also the government, like the state government, that doesn't let them build on farmland, and they're not allowed to like create zoning, and they have crazy laws for that. And I mean, there's always this kind of short-sightedness for government, especially when you're dealing with like elected officials who are only there for a couple years. But it's a hard question to answer. It really is. The only time the FAA has ever come in time and on budget on any project that they've ever done is when they instituted their flight control system, and it was paid for entirely by the airlines. It's a barrier that we have to start addressing. We have to make our government more flexible, and we should start soon.
Okay, a question here.
Hey, Jenny with Tech Change. Just a quick comment, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe it's because I'm a millennial. I really view a lot of the jobs we have today, which didn't even exist when I was in college a few years ago, really are just repeats of what we've always had. I view my job when I was working in social media as just being a cultural anthropologist. I think user experience engineers are not really a lot different than urban planners. You're designing how some people interact in an environment. And I'm just curious to kind of hear your thoughts on the way that education will play a role in the future, because I personally think there's a lot of importance being put on STEM, but I think we need to treat everything kind of equally. Philosophy and art and all these things are playing a big role right now. And just kind of hearing your thoughts on the way education will look in the future, and the skills that we'll need for those jobs we don't even know exist in 50 years, and how we weigh technical skills versus things that are non-technical.
I,
I am a professor that does not work on education.
But you educate.
I do a little bit of that. Yeah, I think that that's a really nice point. Sometimes when I feel like I don't have a real job, I remember that being a professor is one of the oldest jobs ever. And you're right. I mean, these jobs fill a cultural void, whether it's connecting with people, imparting a message, fixing something that's broken. I think that that's one way to find comfort in a very fast-moving environment. I would say that education, it probably will play a huge role. I think we've had quite a bit of education inflation, which I should not say. I work for a master's program. But most of the skills that you want to learn, you can learn. You can learn anything. The internet is great for that. But a lot of people want, this formal recognition on their CV. So maybe there will, with the gig, what's it called?
economy.
Gig economy. Maybe we will be a little bit more product-based. If you write well, if you draw well, if you create something great, maybe it won't matter so much. I'm sure, though, we are going to see at Georgetown, and every university has programs popping up to meet sort of the new demand for a changing economy.
Consumer X.
Consumer X had the opportunity in a professional context a few years ago to do a survey of business executives, and it was on what these executives' views were on what they needed in the workforce, what kind of educational preparation, and so forth. And we had an expectation that there'd be a lot of, well, we need technical people and this and that. In fact, the survey found that these executives were looking for people with critical thinking skills, teamwork skills, problem solving, things that go beyond technology. They also go beyond any one discipline, whether you're talking about STEM fields or philosophy or writing and so forth. So it goes to your point, which is maybe it shouldn't all be about STEM. At least these executives thought a little bit differently. But then secondly, it should be more about breaking down walls of disciplines and bringing some of the spirit of, say, the liberal arts into technology and design and that sort of thing.
One of the things we do at Georgetown is try to teach people to become double deep. So they're good in one field and they get expertise in another. And because it's the communications, culture, and technology program, often they're getting technology in addition to what they learned as an undergraduate. So you have journalists who become social media mavens, you have political scientists who become experts in tech policy, you have international relations people who learn how global decisions at the IGF, at the United Nations, at the World Trade Association, Trade Organization are affecting the development of the internet. So it's a real scarce skill to have double deep or even triple deep, and a lot of the new jobs are going to be in those places where you can combine 2 or 3 disciplines, the tools from 2 or 3 disciplines, and that makes it a lot easier to move from one career to another. I gave a commencement address at the University of Maryland 2 years ago, and you can find a Twitter version of it. Somebody captured it on Storify, and the point I kept coming back to was be ready for change. Don't just learn something, learn how to learn how to teach yourself, and most importantly, learn how to have a network of people who will teach you throughout your entire career, and that's social media in particular. That also helps with this fear of disruption. If you have a group of friends that you can get support from, you can ask questions of, that helps you too get through the disruption that comes. Next question.
Hi, Rami Kader. Thank you very much for the great panel. I could literally hear this stuff all day. So I have kind of a question and a comment. What I'm noticing is when you guys seem to be discussing technology and government or other bodies, it's as if they're separate. But I think that's because, but for example, I see many different examples across the world where they blend, and they're blending to the benefit of everyone. I'll give you a distinct example. India has a power grid problem where large portions of it go out black for 8 hours a day, all this good stuff. So the government was building plants here, here, and here, and people were saying you're building them in the wrong places. So they started to report via a hashtag the outage, when it started, when it ended, and then it helped guide the government to know where the outages were actually going. I see this going on in the developing world all the time, and it's like social media and technology have become integrated and part of that governmental infrastructure. That's usually because the governments are lacking in some areas. Do you think developed countries have a problem in that they have efficient old systems that don't want to change, and are they mutually exclusive? Is that the issue? Like, other countries can leapfrog governance? And at the same time, are there good examples of it being done correctly in the United States, merging the two? Thank you.
I hope this is responsive. The canary in the mine shaft on this, and maybe even the prior question about trust in government and things, might be the open government, open data movement. I mean, if that succeeds, if it takes off, if there are new ways, as you're suggesting, that government officials decide to interact with stakeholders, constituents, and stuff like that, and that there's a bottom-up effort, that might solve the trust problem, you know, assuming polarization mutes itself in a variety of ways. And an example that I've just heard, I haven't fact-checked this, but I believe it because it comes from a really smart woman, Beth Novak, who used to work at the technology office in the White House, has just done a sort of informal canvassing, and there are now 500 federal civil servants, according to her, part of whose job is to be prize administrators. Their job is to construct prizes so that citizens can make their own contributions about how to do problem solving with money going to the winners. And, you know, there were 0 of them probably 3 years ago. And so you would hope that, again, sort of in this open government, open governance environment, maybe some of the worst problems of trust and worst problems of transparency and worst problems of old systems not adapting to new realities get washed away.
Thoughts?
So ITIF is actually working on a report right now about kind of government productivity and increasing it with IT. And when you think about government, it's fundamentally an information service. And usually information services, a net part of their budget, at least about 4% of their budget, goes to IT costs, where the standard government, including states and the federal government's a little bit more, but it's about 2% here. And we're grossly underspending on IT. And so we still see a lot of legacy systems and a lot of data that is being used in, like, a great example is Indiana, which is using a lot of their data to kind of find and fix, let me think, what was it? I'll think of it in just a second. But we're seeing especially apps and self-service things pop up that is able to increase both the government's productivity and the citizenry, like the Boston example with the ability for them to take photos of potholes and telephone it in, but also with the ability for people who go out into the field, like with apps to record all of their information that is automatically uploaded. And so we're starting to see governments kind of get in the information game and get more productive, but there's just a lot of institutional barriers that keep their budgets low, that keep them trying to basically cut costs at all costs, rather than look in the long run and say, hey, if I spend this much money, I get this many benefits and this many benefits for the citizenry this way. They're thinking of how much can I save right now by using the cloud, which is good, but it's not enough.
Yeah, I think that this is a field, e-government, and some of the initiatives are really, really cool. I think the pothole one's a great example of how we're a little bit like, okay, let's not turn everything into an app just yet, since not everybody even has a phone. So that's, I think that there is a good level of restraint. I'm sure that a lot of it has to do with people not wanting to learn new skills in the government itself. But I guess for me, it seems like the U.S. government is very well known for being very data heavy, right? Everything comes down to an economic analysis. And when you have technical tools to solve certain problems, sometimes you don't have the big conversation that you need to have. And I think we've been dogged a little bit for doing that too often. So we're sort of not taking advantage of these great smaller e-government, especially for local communities. They do some really, really neat stuff, and then sort of using them on these large scale things and not having the big questions. So I think that we're probably doing an exceptionally bad job, but that based on what works for other countries, I think we will start borrowing some things.
X, did you have any comments?
None on this.
Okay. So we have just enough time for one more questions, and then we'll have time for our door prizes. I've always heard that the last question is the worst question, but let's go with it.
That's why I like Mike so much.
I didn't say the questioner was the worst questioner.
Couple of things that I was running in to find my other volunteer photographer to get her SD card, but the topic was so interesting I had to stay. The first thing you were saying, Mike, was about how great the German system is, and I was part of the apprenticeship program in Ontario, and what was very clear in Sweden and in Germany is that every year when the company had to report their income tax, they had to state their needs for hiring. And yes, we're going to be needing X number or more machinists. And so the schools actually knew what the needs of the community was. And so instead of what you guys have the same thing in the States as we have in Canada, one year you have too many nurses and the next year not enough nurses. And this is ebb and flow constantly, and it's a serious problem. So yeah, I think we need to change some fundamental things within the school system. And then when I was listening to great questions, this gentleman beside me here asked about he was mentioning about the grid in India, and I worked with the UN and IEEE, and we worked on the Millennium Goals, and 3 of the goals we dealt with one was on reliable electricity, and we came up with an open source 1 kilowatt energy system off the grid, which is perfect for India. And what was interesting is when we worked as a team, we were moving towards implementation, and then the earthquake hit Haiti, and then the money disappeared. And it's funny how all the not-for-profits disappeared that were part of the process, because we needed the not-for-profits, humanitarian groups, and the engineers there, because it's just not one conversation, which we found with the World Bank in Africa, with many of the power plants where they just imposed it. So I guess my comment to the committee, and I really like what I was hearing, is that I'm seeing some real disconnect with the educational system, more serious. Now, go back to Darwin. I think Darwin went to school to become a pastor. You know, he didn't get trained to become an evolutionary biologist. So I think we need to go back, and myself, I'm totally involved in technology, but my background originally is social anthropology, which has nothing to do with this. On the other hand, it really does. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to look at not our resumes, but our achievements. You know, they're not basically a hitching post, but more of a guidepost.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Darwin did have the advantage of taking a very long vacation on the HMS Beagle, where he got retrained. Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts on that? On changing education?
So another prediction that a growth industry sector in the years to come is going to be the credentialing sector. All this education is going to be taking place, and there's going to be a really interesting sort of process of badging and identifying people who have mastered certain skills that you can walk in and hand that to the employers that you're trying to train for. And there are a lot of companies that are in this space. There are a lot of nonprofits. You know, the most interesting stuff for my money is going on at Mozilla. It's just sort of certifying who knows what and how good they are at stuff. So, not responsive to you, but as the education ecosystem proliferates, this is going to be part of it.
Okay, I promised you some door prizes. So our first door prize goes to the best question, and the panelists are going to consult here and figure out the best question.
And customer X is taking the bag off. It's pretty hard.
No, okay.
Not yet?
Not yet. Okay, so do you have a nominee for best question?
I like the India.
So the panel has determined that Our first question was the best question, Lee Marie, asking how do we make sure that that everyone's involved in development of applications so it meets the needs of everyone. Now, you're going to determine who the most interesting answer came from. So let me just go down for each of our 4 panelists, and you will cheer or clap, and we'll determine, my fine-tuned ear will determine who you think had the most interesting answer. It's not who's the best panelist. It's who had that wonderful little insight that, you'll remember in a year or two. We need an app for this. This is true. Okay, so.
Decibel meter.
This is decibel meter, yes. So, Lee Rainey, please clap. Okay. Customer X. Okay. Meg Jones. Alan McQuinn. Ooh, it's tough. It's tough. Okay, I think the answer is.
You forgot you. Forgot you.
Oh, okay, Mike Nelson. Okay. Oh, Mike was last. Okay. Okay.
Eat your own dog
And there's a
food.
third door prize. Can anyone guess who customer X is? Any other guesses? If you guess right, you get the bag. Otherwise, he's got to wear it all afternoon. Okay, John Horrigan, formerly FCC. So, the prize for best question is a tinfoil hat.
You're so funny. Thank you.
I get one too. So you don't have to wear them all day, Lee Marie, but
I'm really glad I didn't.
I meant to put a string on it so it stays on better. But anyway, I hope this is not being tweeted.
Panel.
But thank you all for being here.